We're going to go through this shorter chapter, which is called Propulsion through the GI tract. In the last lecture, you saw that there are different types of movements. There are mixing movements, and then there's propulsatory movements like peristalsis, which help move things forward. So everything in this chapter is going to go through propulsive movements through the GI tract, going in each area. So the learning objectives will start with essentially going through the different reflexes and the different propulsatory movements. So we'll start in the mouth with deglutition, which is how we say chewing, but the chewing and swallowing response is part automatic and part under your conscious control. And then we'll describe propulsion through the variety of other anatomical structures down from the mouth. So the esophagus, stomach, small and large intestine, and we'll make sure we know the propulsive and mixing movements in each area. You'll also see that there are some special movements in each area that are typically named for a person who discovered them or the part of the body that's in control of that. We'll talk about what enhances or inhibits the movements. So you should already know that the myenteric plexus is the part of the enteric nervous system, which runs these slow wave potentials to keep things moving. And you should also know that the parasympathetic system enhances these movements generally, whereas the sympathetic system inhibits movements through the GI tract, with the exception of the colon. So we'll get to that a little bit today. And so we start with chewing and we'll end with defecation. So start to finish. Just for some quick review, this whole process of food making its way from the mouth to the anus takes about 24 to 48 hours. So we're going on really a 2-day journey through the gut. So the mouth is where we have the beginning of these propulsive movements. So you see a sagittal section here of the head, and we're looking at the main pieces that are important to deglutition. So we have the lips, the jaw, the associated TMJ, and you'll know that that's the masseter muscle that's very large and helps with these chewing movements. And then the tongue is a huge muscle that is important in activating the automatic or reflexive parts of swallowing. There is the hard palate and then the soft palate a little bit further back. And then the open space in the throat is going to be called the pharynx. So the pharynx is separated into different parts, and it is named for what it's continuous with, meaning what it's next to. So there's the nasopharynx area up near the nasal cavity. There is the oropharynx area behind the oral cavity, and there's the laryngopharynx behind the larynx, which is the enlarged portion of the respiratory system that we talk about later. So once things make their way into the pharynx, that's generally going to be the time when we no longer have a ton of conscious control over swallowing and chewing. Pretty much once it gets past the pharynx, everything is now reflexive. Another thing I want to point out is the epiglottis, so that in ideal situations will lower to cover the opening of the larynx so that food doesn't, or fluid doesn't move into the trachea. If it does, that's called aspiration, and the epiglottis should help prevent that. So when food enters the mouth, ingestion is typically stimulated by appetite and hunger. Those are homeostatic processes that are mediated by the hypothalamus and the thalamic areas that help kind of set these kind of baseline caloric needs for the body. And the appetite is meant to drive hunger and drive the seeking of food when we are not meeting our caloric needs. So ingestion is when you take in food or drink. So you have a basal need to do that, which is set by the hypothalamus. Then, after the food is ingested, there's mechanical breakdown, which is called mastication or chewing. So that's going to involve the tongue, the lips, the buccal mucosa, which is the inside of the cheek, mixing the food together with the saliva to form a bolus of food plus saliva. And once everything has been masticated appropriately, deglutition is the swallowing response that's going to occur that we'll see in a little bit. Essentially, the tongue is going to push against the hard palate and force the food back into the pharynx area where it can then go on its journey. There is a little bit of digestion, remember, in the mouth. There's salivary amylase, which is going to break down starches. This is salivary lipase. We're actually going to go ahead and change that. It's lingual lipase, because it's secreted by the tongue. So those things can break down starches and fats right there in the mouth. So just a little note about mastication. So this is obviously a mixing movement and not so much propulsatory. This is the chewing that occurs to break down food. So your jaw muscles, your masseters are very, very strong. The incisor teeth at the center of the mouth, there's about 55 pounds of force that can be generated by them. The molars, we can have about 200 pounds of force being generated by these back teeth. The fifth cranial nerve gives the motor innervation to these areas. Overall control of mastication is a brainstem area that we'll talk about in just a little bit. But essentially what you see is the chewing reflex. You have food in your mouth, the jaw reflexively drops. You don't have to think about doing that. So part of this is just reflexive. If we think about physiology 1 in those reverberating circuits where you activate them and then they come back and then activate themselves, chewing is an example of one of those cyclical or cycling types of automatisms or self-generated patterns. So the jaw drops and there's rebound contraction because remember when muscle is stretched, it responds by contracting. So the jaw drops and then the masseter will contract. The food's pressed against the buccal surface. That is the signal for the jaw to drop. And remember the buccal mucosa is the lining of the inside of the mouth. Here, what you see, these are adult teeth, and we can tell that these are adult because children, deciduous teeth or milk teeth, your primary teeth, there's only 20 of them. In adults, there are plenty more. The center ones are the incisors, which are meant for tearing and ripping into things. Same thing with canines. And then we can tell that we're omnivorous because we have teeth for ripping and tearing, and then we have flat teeth for grinding and chewing, which are the molars. The third molar is typically extracted in the United States. There's not a real medical need for that. It's mainly just aesthetics, given the cost of orthodontic medicine. It's about $5,000 for braces. So when these do come in, it crowds the teeth together and then ruins all that money that it was spent by whoever paid for the braces. So that's chewing, and we'll take a little look at this, but just know you put food in your mouth, the jaw drops when the food comes into contact reflexively with the inside of the mouth, and then there's a rebound contraction of the masseter, and then that just happens again and again until there's physical swallowing or deglutition. So this can be broken up into 2 different stages. The voluntary stage, which is going to be driven by your skeletal muscle, which will initiate swallowing. And then there's the pharyngeal stage, which is involuntary, which moves food through the pharynx down to the esophagus. There's not a lot of conscious control over that. There's almost no conscious control. However, if you've ever gotten something, like if you swallowed gum accidentally, you can still kind of force a gag response to bring that up. So there's a little bit of voluntary activity, but not a lot, especially not in general non-choking type behavior. And then there's the esophageal stage once the food is there. So this is a pretty straightforward process. It starts in the mouth, so the inside of the mouth is the buccal mucosa, and then the pharynx, and then the esophagus. So those are the 3 phases that we'll see. Here we see our swallowing center, that's in the brainstem area. There are projections from the vagus, there's the glossopharyngeal nerve, and then also the trigeminal nerve allow this deglutition response to happen appropriately. And glosso means tongue, and pharyngeal means the pharynx. So glossopharyngeal, it runs right next to the carotid, and that helps innervate a huge amount of the esophagus. All right, so if we follow this swallowing response, here's an individual. They have a bolus of food in their mouth, and the tongue, this really big muscle, is working on the food, pushing it against different places in the mouth. And when the buccal phase, this voluntary phase, happens, there is this voluntary control over swallowing, and people can choose to chew the food longer if they would like, or shorter if they would like as well. So also remember that this upper esophageal sphincter is not open in typical situations. It's generally closed, meaning if anything got down here without you swallowing, it should be closed. However, once something makes its way into the pharynx, it typically stretches that area, and we know stretch is what initiates these waves of contraction. So in this buccal phase, once the tongue pushes really hard against the top of the mouth and the hard palate, that will force the food out from the mouth, and it'll start to slide back into the pharynx area. That will hopefully initiate, too, the epiglottis to start moving down over the trachea. And that's what we see in this picture. We see the epiglottis now folded down so that food or liquid doesn't have access to the respiratory tract. So remember, once you move from the mouth to the pharynx, it's now mostly involuntary. So this picture uses very anatomical terms. It calls it the pharyngeal esophageal phase. So going from the pharynx to the esophagus, just a couple of seconds there. The uvula and larynx rise to prevent food from entering the respiratory passageways. The tongue blocks off the mouth when you swallow so that food doesn't come back up. The upper esophageal sphincter relaxes to allow passage of food or the bolus now into the esophagus. And now the esophagus will engage in typical peristalsis to start moving it down the length of the esophagus. So once the esophagus is stretched and peristalsis begins in the esophagus, that is also the message to the upper esophageal sphincter to constrict so that we no longer have this opening there. So this upper esophageal sphincter is only open for a brief amount of time when swallowing occurs, and then it closes right away when everything is working appropriately. When there is damage to the glossopharyngeal nerve, you will see difficulty swallowing, which we call dysphagia. Okay, so here what we see is the esophageal phase, and once we're into the esophagus, then there's peristalsis. Remember from the last lecture that there's two different types of muscle. There is longitudinal muscle, which works as a sheet, meaning this wave would start up here and squeeze the muscles to move the food down. But there's also the circular muscle. And to move things in peristalsis, there needs to be a band of contracted circular muscle behind the bolus, and there also needs to be a dilated band of circular muscle in front of the bolus. So constriction behind, dilation in front of. While the food or bolus is in the esophagus and moving through peristalsis down towards the stomach, the lower esophageal sphincter is closed also. So during the esophageal phase, both sphincters are closed, okay? We should only have opening of the lower esophageal sphincter in the case that food is moving from the esophagus into the stomach. So this is what we see. We have started to relax these esophageal muscles because peristalsis has moved the food down to this point. The circular muscles contract to keep constricting behind the bolus. When there is presence of food right by the sphincter, remember, stretch is going to be the main signal for things to engage. So the stretch of that area encourages the lower esophageal sphincter to open so that food can then enter the stomach. And then hopefully the lower esophageal sphincter constricts immediately after that too, so that both upper and lower sphincters are constricted. So here's the whole process, starting in buccal, pharyngeal, esophageal phase, and we see peristalsis, this nice propulsatory movement, moving in a nice long wave, food as a bolus down to the stomach. Okay, nervous initiation. One brain area that I mentioned before that's really important is the NTS, the nucleus tractus solitarius. That's the main nuclei that's involved in appetite and feeding and organizing all of these nervous activities together. We have innervation to the pharynx, and then we have innervation to the upper and lower esophagus. So we'll see that the vagus is very highly involved. We also have the glossopharyngeal involved, and then the phrenic nerve innervates the diaphragm. And you'll see that whatever stage you're in of swallowing, it will interrupt respiration briefly because the diaphragm can't be moving up and down during swallowing. All right, so these upper areas or down here, the tonsillar pillars. So if you think about where your tonsils are, it's back towards the throat. They're really heavily innervated by these different higher centers like the NTS and these other nuclei. And so those help initiate swallowing so that when, again, the food moves from the mouth to the pharynx, that will stimulate these receptors there so that we start to move food down in a peristaltic process. Again, the trigeminal and the glossopharyngeal nerves, those are going to generate impulses along with the medullary regions, which can send feedback to them as well. And all of those things integrate together with the nucleus tractus solitarius. So that's going to be the main integrating center. Automatic initiation of subsequent stages. So remember, we have stretch as the main indicator for when we're going to have contraction of muscles. The other areas that are important, the reticular substance, that's also called the reticular activating center, is also in the lower medullary areas that helps to activate the subsequent responses by the stomach and things of that nature. There's also a deglutition center, so we see that up here. And motor impulses from the deglutition center, they go and travel out to the pharynx and upper esophagus. The cranial nerves involved in this process are 5, 9, 10, and 12. If I haven't said this already, if you don't have the names and numbers memorized of the cranial nerves, that is something that you need to do, not for just for this class, but your boards will say CNX, for example, rather than saying the vagus. So you have to know them interchangeably. All right. Okay, so as I mentioned, whatever point you're at in swallowing, it will interrupt respiration briefly. So the pharyngeal stage, as I mentioned, is just a couple of seconds. It's 6 seconds long, and it interrupts a fraction of the respiratory cycle. So maybe you're breathing in or breathing out, but that will determine at what point or what shape your diaphragm is in. Because your diaphragm is this nice bell-shaped muscle, and when it's relaxed, it's in a bell shape. When it contracts, it moves down straight, and it puts pressure on the stomach. There is a hole in the center of the diaphragm called the esophageal hiatus, and that's where the esophagus travels through or pierces the diaphragm to get to the stomach. So we want to have the diaphragm relaxed so that food can move unimpeded through propulsion to the stomach. So the higher centers, so those would indicate thalamic areas, hypothalamic areas, they signal to the respiratory centers and the swallowing centers. So the respiratory centers we talk about later in the respiratory chapter, but there's one that's really important. It's called the DRG. I'm going to write it down here, the DRG, which stands for dorsal respiratory group, which is just a group of neurons that essentially instigate you breathing. So they make the diaphragm pull down. So there's other things that can affect the DRG, but they turn it on or off. That's the main generator of respiratory activity. So the DRG sends messages down to their motor neurons, like the intercostal nerves, the phrenic nerves, to alter the diaphragmatic activity, and then it will also go and innervate the lungs so that we can change the size of the lungs and inhale or exhale. The swallowing centers, as you saw on the picture before, so we've got DVN there, those are going to be associated with, so that's dorsal ventricular nucleus. You'll see different names for things. That's okay. Together, we separated them out in this picture. We've got the dorsal swallowing group, DSG, and the ventral swallowing group. Those send innervation out through motor neurons, the cranial nerves that we talked about, so glossopharyngeal, vagus, trigeminal, and they also send information to the upper airway esophagus so that we have some control and some feedback to what's going on in that area. So when there is stimulation by things like food in the upper airway esophagus, the stretch receptors there send that information to the nuclei that's important, the NTS, the nucleus tractus solitarius, so that it can signal to the swallowing groups so that we get swallowing. And at the same time, we want these swallowing centers to inhibit these respiratory centers. That's why you have minuses here. The respiratory centers can also inhibit swallowing, and the swallowing centers can inhibit the respiratory centers. Fun little thing that kind of ties us a little bit together, maybe not much, but when you think about this, the shape of the diaphragm, it's kind of like this little oval here that says stimulation inside of it. When the stomach is really full and presses against the diaphragm, that's when you hiccup. So if we think about these things acting together, there's a lot of innervation that's shared between those. So things like stimulation through a stomach being really full, pushing on the diaphragm causes respiratory changes like a hiccup. Fun times. All right, so when you swallow, you don't just have one wave of peristalsis that moves everything down. You might even think of a time when you've eaten something really dry, like maybe some pizza crust or something, and it felt like it didn't go all the way down and kind of got stuck. Your body doesn't just give up when that happens. There is a primary wave of peristalsis that goes all the way from the pharynx and goes down to the esophagus. And it takes about 8 to 10 seconds for that primary wave of peristalsis to happen. The food gets to the stomach in 5 to 8 seconds. Because of gravity, that's one thing. It takes longer when you stand on your head. It does move your food to your stomach, but it takes longer, and to the really strong peristaltic waves. So if there was anything left over, secondary waves come in and continue squeezing down the esophagus to move everything down to the stomach. That is the job of the myenteric plexus. Remember, myo is muscle. So that will generate waves to move the food down, and that will be stimulated only by the stretch of the food in the esophagus. And these secondary waves continue until all the food is now in the stomach. There's also local reflexes from the vagal fibers that begin in the pharynx and go to the medulla. That's called the vagal-vagal loop. So information can be sent up the vagus and then move back down the vagus. So, hey, there's food here, let's swallow again, and then it comes back down, so we get swallowing. So there's not just one wave, there are multiple waves until everything is done. All right, then we have musculature. Some of the muscle in the esophagus is going to be striated or skeletal, and some is smooth. So not only does that tell you what parts of swallowing are completely involuntary and which ones are voluntary, that also tells you what types of disorders can affect the esophagus. So the upper pharyngeal wall is striated muscle, so that's all skeletal, and it's innervated by the glossopharyngeal and vagus nerve. I mentioned before that it runs next to the carotids, the glossopharyngeal, right down the neck. So if a patient has surgery where they're getting a carotidectomy, that means taking a clot or something out of the carotid, the surgeon clamps the glossopharyngeal to move it out of the way to have access to the carotid. What that means is once that was clamped surgically, that nerve is going to be altered in its activity for a little bit of time, but usually you have difficulty swallowing in patients after surgeries that just clamp the glossopharyngeal. So you'll see slurring, you'll see salivation, and then difficulty swallowing because of just clamping the glossopharyngeal. Same thing with the vagus, that innervates the upper portions as well. And that's not surprising. The vagus innervates, 95% of things with parasympathetic input. Okay, the upper third of the esophagus is striated muscle, also innervated by the glossopharyngeal and vagus. So that lends itself to the dysphagia conversation. When there's any damage to the vagus or glossopharyngeal, there will be difficulty swallowing, and with the orchestration of movements. So sometimes swallowing might be painful because we're not getting this wave of dilation before the bolus moves down. And that's up to the myenteric plexus and the vagus to figure out. So sometimes that can be restored. That's something ENTs help with, actually, and speech pathologists to help with swallowing. The lower 2/3 of the esophagus are all smooth muscle. So, whoops, this is going to be completely involuntary. It's innervated by the vagus nerve, and there's a myenteric plexus in the level of the esophagus. If you do cut the vagus because of the myenteric plexus, the food does move to the stomach, but it's not as orchestrated. So I want you to know that the myenteric plexus is so strong that you can move food very easily. All right, hang on one second.